There's definitely some kind of weird timey-wimey BS going on in Teyvat. I mean, just look at the bootstrap paradox in the Space and Time for You quest, or the infinite samsara in Sumeru's Archon quest, or Wanderer's selective timeline deletion shenanigans, or planting a seed from the present in the past somehow. There's just too much bizarre time-related weirdness to ignore, really. And everyone has their own theory about what's actually going on here. Some say it's time dilation, others say it's mere memory manipulation, courtesy of Irminsul, but the bulk of people seem to favor the time travel theory. Especially now in version 6.2, because if there's no time travel, then how would the long-dead iridescent moon know Columbina's name before she even got to choose it for herself? Surely the power of the moons transcends time itself, allowing for travel between the past and the future, right? Lunar time travel could also explain other things in the recent quests, like maybe it was Columbina from the future who erected the barrier over Hiisi Island during that one fight with Rerir. And listen, I'm not gonna poo-poo anyone's theory because I think the whole time travel thing is actually a pretty logical conclusion to come to, and it could very well be the correct conclusion. But I will play devil's advocate here because I personally despise time travel. Just the thought of being able to go back in time and change something so you can fix the events of the future, it's yucky. Besides, I don't actually think the rules of Teyvat as we know them allow for time travel. Time manipulation in some way, sure, but not time travel. Because if we could time travel and then change the events of the past, then why didn't we, I don't know, stop the cataclysm from happening? I mean, if Columbina really was traveling back through time, why didn't she stop Rerir from becoming a sinner in the first place? Something just doesn't add up. There has to be something else going on here. And I think that with Durin's help, I can prove it, or at least make a really good case for it. And that's what we'll be doing today. And you all know the drill by now. We've got timestamps, spoiler warnings, links to related content in the description box if you want them. And we're also gonna have some post-video notes and corrections in the pinned comment. We've got a lot to cover and I don't want to make you wait any longer, so let's just dive into what we know about how time works in Teyvat so far, shall we? So this debate about whether we have time travel or no time travel started way back in Inazuma upon the release of A's second story quest. In that quest, A received a magic seed from her sister Makoto's residual consciousness, which A then planted within Makoto's realm of consciousness. The seed then took root in Inazuma's past and grew into the sacred Sakura tree in the real world. So basically, A sent a seed back in time so it could grow into a tree, thus changing Inazuma's history and also its future. Well, that certainly feels like time travel to me. I mean, just look at the travelogue summary. It says the sacred Sakura moved from the present into the past and that A walked from the present into the future. That's straight up time traveling. Or is it? See, I don't think calling this time travel makes any sense solely because of the location where this event took place. Remember, we weren't in Teyvat when we did this. We were inside Makoto's mind the entire time. And the seed of the sacred Sakura was nothing more than a thought given shape, a thought that was born within Makoto's mind. But if the seed is only a thought, then how did it grow into a real tree without time travel? Well, unfortunately, we need to look at a few more examples of funky time shenanigans in order to answer that question. And the next time anomaly we encountered was in Sumeru. In the Sumeru Archon quest, everyone in the city was sucked into a dream where time looped around itself in a samsara, with everyone's memories getting wiped between each cycle. Many saw this as foreshadowing. Perhaps time in Teyvat is cyclical, like the dream samsara in Sumeru. Set aside the cyclicality argument for a second, we'll come back to it. What I want to point out is that once again, the time shenanigans are only happening within the collective consciousness, within the mind. And that makes sense because the cognitive realm is the one place where time has no fixed structure. We even saw evidence supporting this during the quest with A, because the traveler described time within Makoto's realm of consciousness as moving backwards and forwards at the same time. Now, generally speaking, we think of time as a continuous line, made up of a series of individual moments. If we were to conceptualize a single moment as a photograph or a snapshot, then the mind is merely a box full of photographs. These snapshots of memory have no fixed position within the box until they are perceived. Only then do the photographs arrange themselves in a very specific order. In Simulanka, Bobarano told us something quite similar.
Well, actually, my view is that the illusion of time is more of a problem of consciousness. gears power the body, while the body is the vessel of the conscious mind. But the mind cannot understand the dimension of time, so we experience instead an endless continuum of moments as the pinion of now turns along the rack of ages.
So essentially, the mind cannot comprehend the true form of time, so when the mind perceives moments, it places them in a continuous order. And the order of these events would be determined by the law of causality, which states that cause determines effect. The moment a jar breaks must be preceded by the moment the jar falls. So moments exist independently but order themselves when observed, and the order is dictated by the law of causality. What's funny is that Bulbarano said all of this in response to Capet insisting that you can turn back time by using a key to make a clock tick backwards. And this is kind of true in the case of Simulanka, but not actually. There are puzzles in the game where you do rewind time to an extent, but all you're really doing is watching history repeat itself. And before anyone says anything, I know that there are some instances where you do rewind time and it looks like you're changing past events. But if you stop and think about it, you'll realize that what you're actually doing is preventing the law of causality from being broken within Simulanka. For example, this little guy was never supposed to fall off the cliff. There exists no moment where he has fallen from the cliff. So if he were to actually fall, causality would break. And that is why this little guy is frozen in time. So the only thing that we're doing by rewinding time here is putting him back to the moment before he falls so that causality isn't broken. To me, this is damning evidence that you can't travel back to the past and change the events that occur because it breaks causality, and causality defines the flow of time. And before you tell me that Simulanka isn't Teyvat, so it has its own laws, let's go back to Sumeru and check in with Wanderer in the time before he was Wanderer. At the end of the Archon quest, Nahida sent Scaramouche and the Traveler into Irminsul to look for information on Descenders. But in the process, Scaramouche learned the truth behind some of the events in his past, so he tries to change the past by altering Irminsul. This certainly isn't an example of time travel, but effectively you're trying to do the same thing, right? You're trying to change the events of the past. You are trying to alter causality. Now, Irminsul is kind of like the collective consciousness of Teyvat. It's the memory of the world, if you will, which makes it very similar to Makoto's realm of consciousness, just on a much larger scale. And like I said, Simulanka established that the past cannot be changed because it breaks the law of causality, so Wanderer cannot change the events of the past. All he can do is erase his name, and this causes everyone to forget who did all of those things in the past, but the events themselves remain unchanged. This fact used to be somewhat debatable, but now we know for certain that this is the case because in version 6.2, Sandrone recites something that Wanderer said to her in a time before he erased his name, but she doesn't remember that it was Wanderer who said it, even though he's standing right in front of her. So that event still took place. Wanderer was still the one who said those things to her, she just forgot it was him. The past remains unchanged, even when it forgets your name. And you can extend this logic to what happened to Rukkhadevata. She made the world forget her too, but that's all. The events of the past never changed, and we know this because her name still exists on a throne within the Eternal Oasis. Now, it was around this time that my fellow theorist Roosevelt and I started talking about the possibility that Teyvat wasn't following a linear timeline model, but a block time model. And Mawika all but confirmed that to be true in Netland.
Most people perceive time as a linear concept, almost like a straight line that can only move forward. We cannot change the past or predict the future, but there's also a different theory, one that I believe to be closer to the truth. Namely, that the past, present, and future all exist at once.
Like Mawika said, block time, or eternalism, argues that every instant of time exists simultaneously, but humans are only capable of perceiving this omnidirectional function of time in a singular direction, which, again, is literally what Bulbarano said in Simulanka. This asymmetric perception of time, moving from the past to the future, is called the arrow of time, or the perceived arrow of time. Now, the direction the arrow of time points in is determined by two important aspects. The first is memory, which indicates the past, and the second is volition, which indicates the future. Volition is kind of like the result of the choices that you make in the present that influence the future. Those choices that you can make in the present are sometimes referred to as free will, or just will if you believe in predetermination. And most block time models are running on the assumption that things are predetermined. And given that Genshin heavily emphasizes the unchangeable past and the unavoidable future, we can assume that Teyvat is also operating under the assumption of predetermination, which it likes to call fate or destiny. So if the events of the past cannot be changed without breaking causality, and thus destroying the concept of time itself, then I can probably end the video right here, right? Case closed. There's no such thing as time travel. Except that even a staunch time travel hater like me has to admit that this idea of absolute predetermination is at odds with Genshin's main theme of changing your destiny, or reweaving fate. So there's definitely something missing from this picture. Something of the timey-wimey variety. Enter the Space and Time for You quest, which took the bench time travel theory and threw it back in the ring, all thanks to the existence of this stupid key. I've made a whole video about this key, and while I don't have any desire to revisit this stupid bootstrap paradox, it is necessary, so here's the short version of the story. About 500 years ago, the twins allegedly arrived in Teyvat, but woke up separately. The Abyss twin woke up first, but found they had a mild case of amnesia as they were unable to remember their twin's existence. Over time, their memories began to return, but despite looking for their twin, they were unable to find them until a Conrian girl named Deirdre showed up with news of the twins' whereabouts, because she had apparently met them, which should be impossible because when the Abyss twin arrived at the spaceship where their traveler twin was, they were still sleeping within the hibernation chamber. They never left. So how did the traveler meet Deirdre if they had never left the ship? It's a bit of a paradox, one that's made worse by the fact that depending on how you respond to the Abyss twin at the end of the quest, you can end up in a situation where there are 3 keys to the hibernation chamber, which should also be impossible unless time travel is involved, since there were only ever 2 keys in existence, 1 for each twin. This third key only appears as the result of a bootstrap paradox, which means that it has no defined origin and therefore should not exist, but does. Which certainly makes it seem like time travel is what's happening here. Except there's a problem with using time travel as a solution here. Well, 2 problems. First off, this Deirdre is not from Conria. She's a character from the book that contains New Conria. So this can't be the Deirdre that met the future traveler and the past Abyss twin, at least not according to the laws of causality that we laid out earlier. And second, while it can be argued that we are all time travelers moving in the direction of time's arrow, our experience in Nod-Krai heavily suggests that the arrow of time cannot point backwards. So the present cannot move towards the past. However, people in the present can witness the events of the past. They just can't interact with or change the past in any meaningful way because that would break the laws of causality. Let me show you what I mean. In the 6.2 Archon quest, we encounter a bunch of phantoms, memories from thousands of years ago that manifested into a form that we can perceive in the present. And these phantoms are basically replaying events from the past on an endless loop. Kinda like Sumeru's dream Samsara and kind of like Simulanka's clockwork time rewind. You can think of this as like the past and present existing in 2 separate but adjacent rooms within a building. No one in the past room can go to the present room, and no one from the present room can go to the past room because there's a wall in the way. But people in the room of the past can talk to the people in the room of the present. Sound, or rather information, can pass through the space-time barrier, which is the wall in this metaphor. We're yelling at each other through the wall. Now this is where I think it's really easy for people to get tripped up because Durin is able to use the power of the Abyss to interact directly with some of the events of the past, although he cannot physically travel there himself. I'll talk more about why this matters in a bit, but do note that no matter the level of interaction, no one, not even Durin, was able to change the past permanently. Those segments of time that Durin messed with continuously reset themselves, and the ultimate fates or future of those people from the past remained unchanged, just like in Simulanka. Alice even confirms this to be the case at the end of the quest. But what's the point of being able to pass information or temporarily alter something in the past if you can't actually do anything with it? But that's just it. You can. While it is true that all moments within a block of time are fixed in place and cannot be changed, who said that time is limited to a single block? Because it's not. And we know it's not because both Anders' daughter and Wanderer added a new block of time onto Teyvat's existing block of time in Durin's story quest. That's how they were able to change fate. And I think I know exactly how this works. In order for me to explain how to change an unchangeable block of time, we're gonna need to recontextualize the question. And that starts by changing the phrase block time into book time. See, Teyvat is a book, or at least it functions like a book. Now, I'm aware I've pitched similar theories before, but I think it bears revisiting in light of new information. And also in light of Hoyo making a planet book already with Amphorius. If you've played Star Rail, then you know what I'm talking about. If you didn't play it, then don't worry about it. It's just precedent. It's not like it's gonna come up again or anything. Now, as far as our current understanding of the lore goes, Nibelung was born alongside the world of Teyvat and is generally regarded as its original creator deity. But if the world functions like a book, then the creator of the world should be like the author of a book. Which means that Nibelung is the author of the book world of Teyvat. And this fits right in line with Nibelung's main power appearing to be that of logos, or language, sometimes referred to as will or reason. I have a whole video on how language creation dragon magic might work that you can watch if you want more information, but all you really need to know is that the dragon god author Nibelung used the power of language to write his little world into existence the same way the biblical god used the power of word or logos to create the universe. There, I saved you 40 minutes. And I think we're being told explicitly this in Durin's story quest when Anders' daughter says that the first magic of the world was called storytelling, also known as the magic of fate. More on this in a minute. Now, a book is the perfect metaphor for block time because all of the events within a book's story exist all at once, but they'll only make sense when you read them in a very specific order. In fact, the process of reading could be likened to the perception of time passing, since you read linearly and time seems to pass linearly. And that means that the pages of the book that are being held firmly in place by the book's bindings could represent the law of causality, aka cause and effect. Now, while you can read the contents of a book out of order, it doesn't actually change the order of the pages or the order of the events within those pages. It only changes your perception and understanding of the book's contents. The beginning of the book always precedes the end, even if you try to read the book backwards. Now, you remember how we were rewinding time in Simulanka? That's no different than rereading the paragraph of a page over and over and over again. The events themselves don't change, but our understanding of the events could change, like they did in this particular instance in Simulanka. We changed nothing, but we understood more by rewinding time in this particular instance. Now, all that said, books don't always exist in such a fixed state. When books are being written, their pages and events within them are malleable, and they stay that way until a book is published. Because it's only once a book is published that its contents can no longer be changed. You can still do minor editing, like scribbling out a few choice words or names from any given copy. Heck, I'd even argue that the power of the abyss that Durin was using to interact with the past was a bit like using black ink to blot out words, but, you know, the story still isn't changing, at least not in any meaningful way. And I say that because we've kind of seen stuff like this before. Remember that Wanderer also couldn't change the past by blotting out his name. He could only stop people from remembering that he was a part of those events. But he was still there. Nothing really changed. So, okay, block time is book time. Moments within block time are like events that happen within the pages of a book. Your perception of time within block time is like a reader reading the pages of the book. You can't change the events themselves, but you can change your understanding of them. In the same way, we can now revisit our original question with new context. Instead of asking ourselves, how do we change an unchangeable past, we can instead ask, how do you change the story of a published book? Well, I kind of already told you the answer earlier when I said you can add a block of time to an existing block of time to change it. So if we just translate that into like book speak, then you can probably change the story of a published book by writing a sequel. Now, this solution is both simpler and far more complex than it first sounds. So let's check in with Wanderer again so he can show us how it works. In Durin's story quest, we found Wanderer at the Academia library arguing with the librarian. He was frustrated that Volume 5 of an unknown to us series was inaccurate and incomplete, so he wanted to replace that Volume 5 with a newly corrected version that he wrote instead. But he couldn't replace the original Volume 5 with his version because that would require removing the original Volume 5 from the library, which he cannot do because it's not available for loan. So if he can't check out the original Volume 5, then he can't replace it with the new version of Volume 5. This is, of course, an abstracted example of being unable to change the past, because the past is what's already been published, and you cannot change the contents of what's been published already. And Wanderer tells us exactly why this is the case. It's because two versions of the same story cannot exist at the same time. It's against Teyvat's rules. And in Teyvat, people's individual stories are their fate. So the same logic applies to anyone who is sharing a fate like Big Durin and Mini Durin. If one fate already exists, the other cannot exist. There can only be one canonical story. And if for some reason two fates or two versions of the same story exist at once, the older or original one will overwrite the newer one. This is why Mini Durin was being forgotten. The fate of the original Durin was trying to overwrite his existence as per the rules. And I don't know why, but like in my head, I just picture this scenario as like Mini Durin on one side and Big Durin on the other in like an old spaghetti western, and they're just going, "This town ain't big enough for the two of us." But then the whole thing ends with a hug instead of a shootout. Sorry, I got distracted. So the situation with the whole Volume 5 thing seemed to be impossible and unresolvable. Until Wanderer took a quick trip into Andersdottir's book and discovered the witch's loophole. While it is true that you cannot return a book that you've never checked out or replace an already published story with a new version, you can create a sequel that extends, embellishes, or changes the meanings of the previous volume's story without actually changing any of the contents of the previous volumes. Just imagine if you were reading a murder mystery book and at the end of the book, the detective caught the murderer and then got them arrested. That's a pretty satisfying and complete ending to the story, right? But now imagine that a couple years later, that murder mystery book got a sequel, and in the very first chapter, it was revealed that the detective from the first book accused the wrong person, and the real murderer is still out there somewhere. That would completely recontextualize the story of the first book without actually changing anything about it, now wouldn't it? That is the fate-changing trick the Hexen Circle uncovered. Wanderer figured it out. And that is precisely why he ended up submitting his version of the book to the library, not as a replacement for Volume 5, but as Volume 6. Because Volume 6 was planned to be released, but it was not yet written. So there was space available for it. That means that submitting Wanderer's book as Volume 6 would not violate any rules. The sequel allowed Wanderer to make the corrections needed to the series and add in all those missing pages that he found. And it also came with the added benefit of him becoming the new author of the series. That changing of the author bit will be important for later, but for now, let's use what we've learned to solve one of our time travel conundrums, the paradoxes found in the Space and Time for You quest. The three main mysteries of that quest are as follows. 1. How did Deirdre meet the Traveler? And tell the Abyss Twin about it 500 years ago when Deirdre is from New Conria, not the original Conria, and when the Traveler was still sleeping in the hibernation chamber. And 2. Why are there 3 hibernation chamber keys when there should only be 2? And the third question I haven't actually posed to you guys yet, why does the Abyss Twin need the power of a world, in this case New Conria, in order to challenge the heavenly principles? Well, let's answer that third question first. If the goal of the Abyss Twin is to challenge the god of the world, and the god of the world is also the author of the world, then to stand on equal footing, the Abyss Twin needed to become an author of a world as well. Hence why New Conria is a book. And that ties into the answers of the first and second question. See, the perceived time travel here should merely be the result of the Abyss Twin successfully adding their Book of Conria to the Book of Teyvat, thus creating a series. They're doing the same thing Wanderer did and adding Conria to the story of the world at the end, so it's like correcting it retroactively. And this is where things get a little bit trippy because the Deirdre that we met both already existed and does not yet exist because the point of the story the Traveler is in exists in the time before New Conria is attached to the story of Teyvat, but the events contained within New Conria will happen 500 years ago. New Conria is a prequel, kind of. Alternatively, you can argue that Conria did already exist, but the Abyss Twin was pulling like a Wanderer and was writing their own sequel to correct or alter the original story by filling in the blanks. The idea works either way and is probably the reason why the Conrian chapter isn't numbered in the Travail trailer. It's not really a chapter, it's a volume. Also, this kind of implies that all of the looms of fate that we've seen so far, or all the things that resemble looms of fate, are actually meant to just be books or book worlds. And that's why they kind of look like hive minds, because they kind of like have to, suck characters into the book. Now, technically, I didn't resolve all of the second question, the part about how we got 3 hibernation chamber keys. And that's kind of because I don't really have a definitive answer for it. And I think that might be the point. See, at the end of Inversion of Genesis, Nicole talked about how it didn't matter what broke the jar, only that the jar broke. It could be a cat that broke it, or a bird. It didn't really matter. We could fill in the blanks for who broke the jar ourselves without breaking the laws of cause and effect. And so long as we do not violate the laws of causality, then anything goes, really, unfortunately. So I think Hoyo might actually be going kind of meta on this one for the keys, and they might leave that closed causal loop completely unresolved and unexplained, because so long as the effects of those keys take place and a cause exists, then the details behind the cause may not actually matter that much. Did we keep the key or give it back to Deirdre? It doesn't matter so long as Deirdre somehow gets the key and leaves it for us to find. The key could be a copy, it could be from another draft of the story that somehow made it into the final publication, or it could have come from outside the story entirely. It doesn't matter. So long as a plot is able to resolve itself, the readers of a story can fill in the blanks with whatever solution they like. And if this is the case, then it's actually a pretty good example of why the sequel method of retroactive time adjustments works. Because all stories come with a lot of blank spaces in them. That is to say, there exists no book where the author described or explained everything perfectly and in total detail, with no room for embellishment or interpretation. Any book containing that level of detail would not only be impossibly long, but it would be tedious to read. So authors just don't do that. Many parts of the story are just implied. Authors tend to just tell the readers the most important things they need to know about, and then rely on the reader's imagination to fill in the blanks for themselves. A sequel that can successfully change parts of the original story does so by taking advantage of these blank spaces and turning them into something new. If this concept sounds kind of familiar, it's probably because Al-Haytham was the one who first brought it up during his teaser trailer when he was talking about the space between words holding more meaning than the words themselves. These blank spaces are undefined variables that you can leverage to do something with, and that's what I think both Columbina and Dottore are doing in Act 6 of the Nod-Krai Archon quest. Now, Columbina's situation is the more complex of the two, so let's start with Dottore. So after Dottore attempts to seize the power of the 3 moons, Alice provides some insight into his movements. Now you remember those phantoms of the past that we saw earlier, right? Well, if we use our book metaphor, then those phantoms would be from an earlier page in the book that somehow folded over itself until it was close enough to touch the present page of the book. This allowed the past and the present to see each other, or rather, to read the contents of each other's pages. This informational exchange is the shouting through the wall bit that I mentioned earlier. Now, Alice says that these exchanges create variables, and those variables can be stacked in such a way that they can change the story. I'm actually really annoyed that the game is using the term variables for this because it means I have to use a more digitized metaphor to explain things, but here we go. You remember what I said about the arrow of time being able to move only in a single direction, and that direction was set by memory, which is the past, and volition, which is the future, or like the process of making the future? Well, time's arrow also has to obey the law of causality, which states that the past, cause, determines the future, effect. But what's in between those 2 points? It's the present, which is represented by choice or will. Now, causality turns the past, cause, into the data set that the present uses to make a choice that will determine the shape of the future, effect. Given that the contents of the dataset never changes, the choices made will always be the same, so the future result will also be unchanging. This is what we call predetermination, or, if you'd rather, the illusion of choice, or a world where you possess no free will. A good in-game example of this is when the Academia used the Akasha system to perfectly predict Cyno's movements based on a detailed record of his past actions. It was only when Cyno encountered an unaccounted-for variable in the desert that the predictive model failed. Now, a variable in this case can be anything that is not clearly defined, and thus it varies. It's what we call uncertainty or blank spaces, as I mentioned earlier, and it's these opportunities where the author did not denote something absolutely that provides space for changes within the story. So Dottore basically located those blank spaces and inserted a prophecy that described a savior who would create a new moon and revive the moon goddess. This prophecy rippled through the past, which created the perfect opportunity in the present for Dottore to fulfill said prophecy. For a limited time, anyway. Because like we saw with Durin, any changes made to the past are temporary. The laws of causality will correct themselves. But I'm pretty sure the short-term offer was the only method available to him because Dotori is not a descender, although he was definitely trying to become one by stealing the moon marrows. Confused? Don't be. There's a very important connection between the power of the moons and the significance of the descenders. And obviously, Dotori's motives of not being controlled by the world, by the story, and breaking free of fate of his own volition. And we can figure out exactly what the connection between the moons and the descenders are by going back to Durin's story quest. I'm not going to recap the entirety of Durin's story quest, but here's basically what you need to know. The first Durin was an abyssal creation of Rhine-Daughter, responsible for nearly destroying Mondstadt during the Conrian Cataclysm 500 years ago. Fortunately for Mondstadt, Durin lost a battle to the death against Dvalin on Dragonspine. But like all three of Rhine-Daughter's known abyssal dragon creations, Durin didn't truly die at this point, but instead fell into a temporary hibernation state, slowly regaining his strength for a prophesized rebirth. But one member of the Hexenzirkel, Anya Marie Andersdottir, had a rather peculiar wish. She wanted nothing more than for Durin to have a happier ending, not a lonely, tragic one full of death and destruction. So she decided to attempt the impossible and tried to change his fate. With the help of Alice and Barbeloth, Anya managed to create the storybook world of Simulanka, which was based on Teyvat, and she made its main character a little dragon named Durin so that his fate would be linked to the other Durin in Teyvat. Because remember, within Teyvat, a name is also a role within a story, and those who are cast in the same role will inevitably share the same fate, because their stories are supposed to be the same. As a quick side note, I recently learned that the whole name is fate idea actually has its roots in science. There have been several studies that conclude we actually grow into our names, meaning the name that we're given shapes how we look. This is connected to the idea that when you tell someone your name, they might respond with, "Oh, yeah, you definitely look like an insert name here." And some scientists summarize this phenomenon by calling a name a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just thought that was kind of neat given what's happening with Durin. So Anya believed that if she could successfully link the fate of both Durins together, she could overwrite the tragic story with a happier one. But linking the fates of the Durins together meant that this new Durin, so Mini Durin, was destined to become a dangerous fell dragon as well, just like the original Durin. So Anya made sure to raise Mini Durin carefully. She taught him right from wrong with her stories and made sure that no matter how dangerous of a dragon he became, his heart would always remain honest and caring. And as long as he was able to stay pure of heart, he would one day meet a group of friends who would help him overcome his dangerous nature, because that was a part of the story that Anya had written for him. But this was just the prologue to her plan. In order for the fates of the two dragons to actually be linked properly, Mini Durin would have to leave the storybook and enter Teyvat. But remember, the rules of Teyvat say that you cannot have two versions of the same story existing at the same time. And because you cannot change the events of the past, Mini Durin would need to become the future of the original Durin. If we compare this scenario to what Wanderer did earlier, then original Durin would be Volume 5 of the Durin series, while Mini Durin would be Volume 6. Now, the game frequently refers to this process as grafting, and it's a pretty good analogy, but if you don't really understand how grafting works in practice, then I think the nuance gets a little bit lost. So, as a former farm kid, let me explain this process using apple trees. Let's say you wanted to plant an apple tree that grew Granny Smith apples. Well, you can't actually plant a Granny Smith apple seed to get that Granny Smith apple tree. And that's because apple trees don't grow true to type. So a Granny Smith apple seed does not produce a Granny Smith apple tree. It just produces an apple tree that produces a random or new kind of apple. So if you want a tree that produces Granny Smith apples, you're gonna need to take a branch from an existing Granny Smith apple tree and then attach it to the rootstock of another apple tree. The branch we took from the Granny Smith apple tree is called the scion wood, and it's generally the youngest shoot of an existing tree. So we can kind of think of this as the tree's future. The rootstock represents the oldest part of the tree because it's the roots of the tree, so it can represent the past. Once you graft that branch of scion wood into the rootstock, whatever apples that rootstock would have produced no longer matters because the grafted scion wood ensures that Granny Smith apples will be produced instead because that's what kind of tree that branch came from. If you consider the rootstock to be the original tree that you were working with, and the tree that you wanted to change the fate of because you wanted Granny Smith apples and not whatever kind of apple it was going to produce, then grafting the Granny Smith apple branch onto the rootstock literally changes the future of this rootstock, of this original tree, because it introduces new variables from an entirely different tree. If we apply this analogy to our Durins, then mini Durin is the scion wood from the Granny Smith apple tree, while original Durin is the rootstock. Now, did we change the rootstock in order to change what kind of fruit that tree could grow? Not at all. We just grafted a new future onto it, which retroactively changes what kind of tree that rootstock is. It could have previously been a crabapple rootstock, but now it's a Granny Smith rootstock because this is a tree that now grows Granny Smith apples. The tree now has a new, previously impossible to achieve fate. Because this is something that would never happen naturally if you just left that rootstock to its own devices. It wouldn't happen. But the Durins aren't really the only example of this happening in game. In fact, this idea of trying to graft on new futures to achieve a previously impossible fate might actually be the reason why so many Archons have a twin or a doppelganger. Having two of you can create new variables. I mean, just compare Durin's situation to Focalor and Farina's. Or if you want more plant-based metaphors, Rukkhadevata literally fashioned Nahida out of Irminsul's scion wood. Nahida became Rukkhadevata's future. Now, in order for grafting to be successful, you have to connect the scion wood and the rootstock in the correct way. And for the Durins, this meant taking advantage of the prophecy of rebirth. That would be the perfect time to replace the original Durin story with the new Durin story. The problem was that this appointed time wouldn't happen until long after Anya was dead. And this is problematic because Mini Durin is a storybook character, and the only thing keeping him alive and keeping his story going is Anya, the author. So if she dies, there's no author to continue Durin's story, which means his story just stops and he's not able to graft himself onto the original Durin's story. For that reason, Anya needed the story to keep going even after she died. So Alice helped her imbue a magic pen with all of Anya's words, so that the pen could continue writing Durin's story until the grafting process was complete. Now here's the other thing about grafting. It's not an instant process. When the scion wood and the rootstock are put together, they're actually taped together. This is like a temporary bond that holds the two pieces of wood together until the fibers of the wood fuse and grow into each other. So even though it looked like Albedo successfully fused the soul of Mini Durin and Big Durin together, he actually didn't. He just stuck the scion wood in the rootstock, and Anya's pen was acting as the binding tape that was holding those pieces of wood together. And this is where we ran into the next big problem, which was that the pen was running out of words and thus running out of ink. If the pen stopped writing, it would be like the tape bindings of a graft failing. The scion wood, or the future, Mini Durin, would fall off the rootstock, original Durin, and only the rootstock would be able to continue to grow. This is why everyone started to forget Mini Durin. The only way Mini Durin could ensure that his story remained attached to the story of original Durin was to finalize the grafting process. So he needed to step into his mother's shoes and become the author of his own story. That way, there would be no need for the temporary bindings of the magic pen. Now, none of this sounds like it has anything to do with Descenders or the Moons or Dottore, but it does. Because see, there's no point in a story existing if there's no one there to read it, just as there's no point in time existing if there's no one there to witness it or perceive it. And this is why, in order for Durin to become an author, he needed to be accompanied by a reader. Alice's magic, which made all of this possible, could not work without both a writer and a reader present. And of course, that reader is the traveler in this case, and the traveler is a descender, which is also sometimes called a witness. And this made me realize that I wasn't just imagining things. Durin is actually supposed to be an allegory for Nibelung, which would make Wanderer an allegory for Voyager, but we should probably talk about that another time. Like, think about it for a second. We have two dragons with power over the abyss, both born alongside their respective worlds and both ultimately becoming the author of their own story. There's obviously more connections between them, but you see this? This shape here? It is literally Amphoreus, the book world planet from Honkai Star Rail. I swear to God, Hoyoverse has one idea and one idea only. They're just really good at remixing it over and over and over again in 1,000 different ways, so you don't know it's that one idea until it's too late. You're already sucked in. I'd love to say that this is just like a one-time coincidence that they've just done this once for Genshin and once for Star Rail, but this is actually like at least the third time over the course of 3 separate games. I bet you I can find more if I go looking for them, but I don't really want to, so I'm not going to. But I digress. If Durin had a descender acting as his reader, then we could assume that Nibelung also had a descender as his reader as well, and I think it was the first descender, the Heavenly Principles. Hear me out on this. When an author finishes a book, especially once it's been published, they technically surrender ownership of the story. I'm not talking about copyright or IP ownership, I'm talking about the loss of control over the story's meaning. Because whoever reads the book is free to interpret, embellish, and fantasize about its contents however they like, and there's quite literally nothing the author can do to prevent it. In fact, one might argue that it is the reader that determines the true meaning behind an author's story, not the author, even though they're the ones that made it. Roland Barthes wrote about this in his essay titled The Death of the Author. I feel like everyone has heard this phrase at least once, probably in the wrong context, but I feel like few have actually read the essay, so there's a link to it in the description if you want it. But for those of you who won't read it, here's the part I'd like you to chew on. Barthes argues that no one can ascertain the true intention of the author, and thus the meaning of any text belongs only to the reader, for the true power hidden within writing is actually reading. And this is why I think Descenders have wills that rival that of a world. They are the ones who determine meaning from the story. They represent that future that the author has no control over. Ergo, as the author, Nibelung's death was inevitable. The author dies when the reader picks up their work. That's the moment a story stops being a mess of drafted possibilities and steps into the realm of publication, the past. And right now, the Heavenly Principles is the reader of the world, the one who ascribes meaning to the words, and perhaps the one who, pulled a wanderer and declared themselves to be the new author of an existing series by writing an unauthorized sequel. But do note that not all readers become authors, although they all seem to have the ability to do so. Just take a look at the second and third Descenders. They don't seem to have written much of anything. Well, nothing that we know of, anyway. It's a bit hard to tell with Teyvat's kind of murky, semi-revisionist history. And there was this one side quest in Simulanka where there were like these 3 main families who all thought that they had the true origin story of, the town. Like their family was the one that was responsible for driving out the big evil dragon in the past, only to find out that all 3 versions of their history were true. And the only reason that happened is because when Anya was writing the story, she wrote 3 different drafts and didn't know which one she liked the most. And then her cat kind of smushed all the drafts together and she was like, I could make all 3 of them canon at the same time. I think I'll do that. And I think about that a lot when we have 3 Descenders. Like, is it possible that 3 versions of history have meshed together and we just don't have the knowledge to decipher the evidence? But the most recent reader of the Teyvat story is the Traveler, and as the reader, their real power lies in their ability to witness, to read, and to interpret and to remember the story of Teyvat as it was written. And by sheer virtue of the nature of their existence, they are an unaccounted for variable, because no author can control the reader. And should this reader decide to pick up a pen for themselves, they will essentially become an author, wielding the power of Logos to write a new chapter in the story. Which is really interesting to me because the power of Logos is usually depicted as being gold, while the power of the Abyss is generally depicted as purple. Something you'll notice is that when Anya's pen is writing Durin's story, the ink is purple. But when Durin takes it over, it turns gold. And I've mentioned this before, again, I made a whole video on this, but I really do think that we should think of the Abyss as if it were ink. Black ink, raw ink, full of possibilities. And if it is ink, then essentially the Traveler's ability to absorb infinite amounts of abyssal energy is like them amassing the potential to write whatever they want to convert that violet ink into golden words. I don't know, I've just been kind of stuck on that thought for a long time. And while I'm writing this tangent in the margins, I may as well mention that I think this whole reader thing might relate to the purpose of visions. Remember how Venti said that anyone who gets a vision has the potential to become a god? Well, visions are called the eyes of God, and if reading is the true power of writing, and writing is the power of an author, then a vision could simply be eyes with which one reads. And if one has the power to read, then they can claim the power to write. Specifically, they write their own stories. They become the god of themselves, essentially. So perhaps the goal of some unknown entity in Teyvat is to give the people the power to write their own stories, just like they did in Simulanka. And if they can write their own stories, then they would be freeing themselves from the heavenly principles, from the clutches of a reader-turned-author who seeks to restrain them by writing their stories for them. And this is an interesting thought because the original visions were moon wheels, which had the ability to grant people a fragment of the moon's power. And we already know that the moons did possess the power of Logos to some degree, not just because Dottore said they did, but simply because they're moons. The power of moons is Kuvaki, it's moonlight, and moonlight is a reflection of sunlight. And if Nibelung is the sun, then isn't their power a reflection of his? I mean, consider the fact that the moons were supposed to be weaving the threads of fate for the world. Because if fate is time and time is the story of the world, then you could say that the moons were spinning yarns or telling tales. They were the magic pens entrusted with continuing the world's story while Nibelung was away. And if this is the case, and I think it is, then we finally know who planted Irminsul. Nibelung did. Now, I was already suspecting that this was the case because not only do we know that Irminsul is well over 6,000 years old, and that the Heavenly Principles is said to have altered rather than created Irminsul, and also the ley lines, making it unlikely that the world tree came from them, but we also have this passage in Hymns of the Far North where Nibelung is called Iannakoinen, which is another name for the primeval blacksmith in Finnish mythology, Ilmarinen. And Ilmarinen is credited for forging the world pillar. Now, this is also nothing I haven't said before, but because of the speed with which Genshin is now pumping out all that deep lore, I haven't really had time to sit and chew on all of this new information for as long as I'd like to. So the implications of this didn't really click with me until recently. See, Nibelung made both the moons and the bones of the earth, and in previous theories, I suggested that the moons are the bones of the earth, because moons have marrow and bones have marrow, and also Kuvaki is like blood, and moon marrow produces Kuvaki, and bone marrow produces blood, and you get the idea. Now, this interpretation isn't entirely wrong, but it isn't entirely right either, because if it was, then the moons and the bones of the earth wouldn't be mentioned as separate creations. I'm sorry I didn't make that connection earlier. There are just some things that you don't really register as important until, you have time to sit with them, which I haven't had. But if the moons are fate-weaving storytellers and Irminsul contains all the memories of the world, then Irminsul is basically a manifestation of the story of Teyvat. But the world tree is also a world pillar, and a world pillar is also known as the axis mundi because it's the pillar around which the world spins. So we might actually be able to think of Irminsul as the spindle of a spinning wheel, which makes the moons the spinners, and their marrows then become the mounds of wool that they spin into yarn or threads or stories that then get recorded in Irminsul. So if you think about it, the moons and Irminsul together make a complete bone because Irminsul is like the exterior hard bone structure that kind of holds everything together, and then the moons are the marrow that go inside and do all of the creation work. And I think this is why Nahida and Rukkhadevata have so much in common with the moons and time and knowledge and their designs, among other things. The moons wield this ink that writes the story of the world on the paper that is fashioned from Irminsul because paper comes from trees. But this also makes me suspect that there must have been a point in Teyvat's history where things only existed as the seed of an idea that had yet to sprout. Without a tree to provide a rigid material structure to contain the story of Teyvat, the actual structure of the world was probably a bit more loosey-goosey, like it was still being drafted. And this kind of matters because when a story is still being drafted, its causality is not yet set in stone. You can still do things like rewind time or erase things or put new things in. We saw a bunch of examples of this in Durin's story quest with all of the bad endings. And if the world was in a drafted state at that time, then that could explain why in the Nod-Krai teaser trailer, the time when the Moon Sisters governed the world was also a time when there was no separation between life and death. The story of time was a work in progress. So Nibelung's out there in deep space, trying to figure out how to write the best future for his little world in light of this abyssal threat that Voyager warned him about, and along comes this descender who reads the story and effectively hits publish. And as an author, Nibelung would have been mostly powerless against a reader. So obviously the only option left to him was to try and use the power of the forbidden knowledge, the abyssal ink, to try to erase the first descender's existence. Which obviously didn't work, but it could explain why Genshin talks about blackened suns all the time. because, one of the names given to the heavenly principles is Phanes, who is a deity whose body is made entirely of light. And yes, it is also another way to talk about an eclipse, a blackened sun. But remember, Nibelung's pens would have been the moons, so I still think this fits pretty nicely, especially since he turned the moons into a weapon. But okay, so recap. The moons. They wrote the story of the world in Nibelung's place, so they were basically like Anya's pens, but for Nibelung. And that's why Dottore wanted their power to become a pseudo-descender. He wanted to become an author, so the world could no longer control him, he would control the world. Now, I think he's attempted to do this a couple of times, but his most recent and noteworthy attempt might have been with Wanderer. Yes, on the one hand, he was trying to make Wanderer into a god, but he never specified what kind of god he was trying to make him into, or even if he expected it to work at all. And this experiment hinged on the power of the Gnosis, which is a fragment of another descender. So his hypothesis was probably, can I turn someone into a descender using a fragment of another descender? To which the answer appears to have been no. So he probably deemed this experiment a failure and moved on to trying to capture the moons. Now here's a question that I don't think any of you have asked yourselves. Where do you think the moons did all of this writing, all of this weaving of fate? Well, in Anya's story, the gods gave the world outside a castle the magic of storytelling. Now, Simulanka is an allegory for Teyvat, so we can infer that Teyvat is also a world outside of a castle. Or perhaps I should call it a palace, a lunar palace. Because the lunar palace, where we know the Moon Sisters spent a lot of time, is very likely to be the place where they wove fate from. Now let's take this a step further by making a small assumption. Since the lunar palace is likely the place where stories were written, then perhaps we should think of it as a mind palace, also known as a memory palace, memory space, or memory journey. Now, the concept of a mind palace is actually part of a memory enhancement technique that's called the method of loci. The method basically involves imagining a physical space like the layout of a building. This is the mind palace. After you've done that, you condense something you want to remember into the shape of a recognizable object, like a souvenir, and then you place that object somewhere in the palace. By using spatial recognition, you can then walk through the mind palace to quickly locate specific memories. And can I just say that this concept makes me really suspicious of the fact that the traveler is collecting souvenirs from all these parts of their journey. And it kind of recontextualizes the rarity level that's been ascribed to them. Because like, the 5-star ones, the gold ones, might be the most important story beats, memories of the main plotline, while everything else of the lower rarities are different levels of importance for the rest of the world building, they're little side stories. If a descender can one day become a god, then having all of these memories that they can put within their mind palace feels kind of important. Now, if I'm right about the Lunar Palace being a mind palace of sorts, then we should also recognize that most of the process of writing happens within the mind, which means that the mind is the space outside of the story. Or perhaps the story is outside of the mind, since, the storybook world was outside of the castle. No matter which way you think about it, this Lunar Palace writer's room has to exist outside the boundaries of Teyvat's time, since time is defined by the story and the story exists outside the castle. And this concept has a lot of precedence in the greater Hoyoverse. And I'm not just talking about Amphorius this time. In the latest Honkai Impact 3rd storyline, the goddess of Mars literally has access to a dream space, which kinda does exactly what I said the Lunar Palace does. I'm not gonna explain all the specifics of it beyond that, but Homo Labs made a really good video about it, so you can watch that if you're interested. Alright, with all those factoids and theories and assumptions under our belt, we can finally talk about all of the time shenanigans surrounding Columbina. And I hope you're ready, because I am certainly not. At the end of Act 6, Columbina escapes Dottore by falling into her own moon gate, and then she vanishes, which raises a very interesting question. Where does this moon gate lead? Now, in a previous video, I said that the moon gate should go to the moon, and that should be the case. All of the evidence that we have points to that, except it might not have gone to the physical moon. And yeah, that makes sense since, Columbina could have just walked through her own moon gate to get to the moon instead of going through all this trouble with the Hyperborean ritual and whatnot. But, when I was thinking about this, I was just like, well, maybe she just lacked the power necessary to complete the trip. Maybe she can only open the moon gate to warp short distances. She has been really weak and low on Kuvaki lately. But at the end of the quest, the traveler and the quest description says that Columbina actually fell into the moon's reflection. And incidentally, the moon's reflection is also where the iridescent moon fled to after her remains fell to Conria, and it's what allowed her to stay lucid for so long. But if the moon gate is supposed to go to the moon but doesn't actually take you to the physical moon, then is it possible that the moon gate actually takes you to the lunar palace? Because, if the lunar palace is a shared mind palace, then it's not subject to the laws of time within Teyvat, so it could explain how the iridescent moon survived so long. And then in Natlan, we learned that the Night Kingdom, where all Natlan's memories were stored, was a reflection of Natlan. And the light of the moon is merely the light that's reflected from the sun. And if the original sun was Nibelung, then the power of the moon is the reflected power of the sun. So that would make the moon's reflection the story of the moons, or the place where the moons go to tell their stories and use their writing powers. So my hypothesis is that Columbina is currently in the process of pulling a Durin and becoming the author of her own story. And what's funny is that in hindsight, Columbina actually says this straight up multiple times. She calls the moon, quote, the home where her story is written. And she even says her, quote, prologue lies beyond the false skies. What an intriguing choice of words in light of all this new context. And if I'm right about the moon's reflection going to the lunar palace, which is like a mind palace for the moon goddesses, then there's actually a very easy to explain scenario where Columbina could go to the lunar palace and meet the other three moons in the lunar palace, because that space exists outside the story, outside the boundaries of time and causality. She could exchange information with the other moons because we know they met thanks to these lines from the iridescent moon. Now, I'm just extrapolating and speculating here, but I think that within the confines of the lunar palace, Columbina might be able to realize that she, much like Durin, could graft herself to an existing story within Teyvat. Namely, the story of the fourth moon that never rose into the sky and instead became the island of Nod-Krai. And I think she could have then taken advantage of Isla, the last archpriestess of the Frost Moon Scions, because Isla was not only the one who witnessed Columbina's birth, but she also was the one who foresaw it, because she apparently had the ability to see through time. Or did she? Because the circumstances of her getting this power are really, really strange, because she's supposed to have gotten it after killing her grandmother Lovia. The problem is, Lovia wasn't a real Frost Moon Scion. She was never in possession of the Frost Moon Scion blood. She couldn't use the power of Kuvaki, so how would the power to see through time have gone to Isla from Lovia, when Lovia should have never had it? Well, I think there's just some really weirdly coincidental timing happening here, because Isla's ability to see through time seems to be an awful lot like the phantom phenomenon that's caused by the trilunar syzygy. So what if it was Columbina who gave Isla the vision of her own birth? Could she not have planted a small seed of knowledge within Isla's mind, and that seed of inspiration created a chain reaction that resulted in the Pillar of Embla reactivating and printing Columbina, who remembered nothing because she only had just entered the story at that time when she was born? And if that sounds familiar, it's probably because this happened to the Abyss Twin too, with Conria. They woke up without their memories too at the beginning of their story. Now, this could explain some of the time travel-y weirdness, but there are some things that remain unsolved here. But to explain those, I'm gonna reference a couple of pretty popular theories. So the first theory is this one that's written by Koi and my friend Leah, there's a link below, and they argue that Columbina must have entered a fifth dimension through her moon gate, kind of like in the movie Interstellar, which then allowed her to transcend time and mess with the past. Specifically, they're arguing that Columbina must have been the one responsible for pointing out the right books in the library, erecting the shield over Hiisi Island during the fight with Rerir, and also naming herself in the past. Now, being the staunch time travel hater that I am, I was initially not very enthusiastic about this idea, and yet, somehow I ended up in the exact same place, but with the Mind Palace solution in place of the whole fifth dimension thing. And I also agree with the two of them that Columbina is likely the one who's responsible for these things and probably some more stuff that we don't even know about. However, unlike Koi and Leah, who can just say, hey, time travel to change the past, I can't do that because of all the things I've laid out in this video so far. My whole thesis relies on the condition that you cannot change the past because it breaks the rules of causality. So how can Columbina be responsible for all these things without breaking causality? That is the real question. And I think Roosevelt might have gotten the answer right when she suggested that Luonatar was responsible for all of this. Now, Roosevelt does argue that Luonatar is actually actually Columbina, but like the Columbina from the past, partially because she's way too special looking for a kuhenki, and she's also far too affectionate to not be Columbina. You should watch her whole video for the full thesis, though. I'm obviously not doing it justice here. But while I am on board with Luonotar being responsible for a lot of these things, at least in part, I'm not really on board with the idea that she is Columbina, partly because she often has these moments of confusion that are completely out of character for the Moon Maiden, and Luonotar isn't technically that unique. She's actually just a type of kuhenki that's had thousands of years to mature. Also, Columbina even says that this particular Luonotar that we've been following this whole time was not one that was born of her blessing, so it had to come from somewhere else. Now that said, Nicole says that Columbina's birth in Nod-Krai was the dying wish of the previous moon goddesses, and we know that these kuhenki take thousands of years to form, and the moons died like, what, 6,000 years ago? So there is a possible scenario where Columbina travels to the lunar palace where she could meet the lingering consciousnesses of the moon goddesses. We know from the iridescent moon's words that they were a bit confused as to why she showed up or what her purpose was, but they did seem to understand who she was and what her existence could mean. So is it possible that the moon goddesses at the time of their death took a gamble and left behind a wish or a legend or a prophecy that one day a fourth moon could be born in Teyvat? Because if so, then perhaps Luonotar and all the other kuhenki were born of that same wish and were responsible for caring for Columbina in place of her dead sisters. And if I'm right about this scenario, then maybe Luonotar knew the Traveler because Columbina told the moon goddesses about them, and they told Luonotar, which is why she recognized them right away and knew what to do. And maybe she was also told to protect Hiisi Island and received a special power to do so. Both Seelies and the moons are very gifted in the skill of prophecy. Who's to say they didn't foresee all of this? And this could explain why Luonotar is weirdly helpful sometimes, but not all the time. Now, the best part of this scenario for me is that the fourth moon already existed as Nod-Krai, so the moons didn't need to break causality to make this happen. All they needed to do was plant the seed of an idea within the story. They imbued the fourth moon's existence with a new meaning, and once enough time had passed, that idea within that seed would take root and sprout. And thus, Columbina would be born from an idea. And this is almost exactly what I think happened with A in the Sacred Sakura. A sakura tree likely already existed, but Makoto had a dying wish. She dreamed of a tree that could protect Inazuma, and she entrusted that dream to A, who took it and gave that tree new meaning in the present, which allowed that thought to ripple through time. This process is directly referenced in the parable of the tree in the book Before Sun and Moon, where it says, "Your one thought shall echo throughout time." That echoing thought is the future recontextualizing the past and granting the world new variables with which to make an even better, newer future with. And be real with me for a second. Do you think it's a coincidence that Makoto's realm of consciousness looks just like the surface of a moon? Because I sure don't. Not with this context. As for the issue of Columbina's name, I think it's possible she told the moon goddesses the name she wished to have, but it's also possible that her name is merely a manifestation of her fate, because names are the role that one takes within the story of Teyvat. They represent fate itself, right? So Hyposelenia means born beneath the moons, which she was always destined to be since the fourth moon was always below her sister since it never rose into the sky. And the name Columbina comes from the word columba, which is a genus of doves, or rather pigeons, and, well, as Wanderer says, pigeons are very good at finding their way home. And Columbina's home is on the moon, because that's where her story, her prologue, began. Ooh, that was a long theory, and there are still things I didn't even get around to mentioning, so I'm gonna continue yapping while all these questionably sane channel members titillate our senses by rolling across the screen in a very predictable way. But I specifically want to talk about Durin because this stuff wouldn't fit anywhere else in the theory, and I tried. I really did. So I've been lightheartedly referring to Durin as Baby Nibelung since he was revealed, not because I thought he actually was a Nibelung reincarnation or anything, but because he was just such a good allegorical fit for the role and it was just fun to think about. And now that Durin has become the author of his own story, and he also has a dualistic form of light and dark, and he also has power over the abyss, well, the comparison suits him even more. But I've already kind of said this. And I think it's pretty obvious for anyone who's paying attention to notice. And if I left it there, it would have just been a cool little detail. But then I noticed something. The song that plays during the final cutscene with Durin and Anya, it is so similar to Greensleeves, which was originally a ballad about a tragic love featuring a woman with green sleeves. But the tune is probably more easily recognized with its more modern lyrics, and also its more modern name, What Child Is This? And that song is about baby Jesus, the son of Mary. And then I started wondering if that was the intent here, because Anya Andersdotter goes by the codename M on account of her middle name, and her middle name is Mary, making Durin the son of Mary, and allegorically Nibelung, who is God, which would make Durin Jesus? And that's funny in its own way, because Durin, like Jesus, was born because of a prophecy, and both Durin and Jesus died once only to be resurrected and leave behind an empty tomb. And under the belief of the Trinity, God exists in 3 forms: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. I don't know who the Holy Spirit is unless it's dead Durin, but Nibelung is called the Formidable Father, so if Durin is the son, then I don't know, man, maybe calling him Baby Nibel was vibe-based theorizing done right. It also makes me wonder about him being called the Undying Flame, because a flame gives off light, and Nibelung being the allegorical sun also has the power of light. And I don't know how many of you have actually read The Little Witch and the Undying Fire. You probably should, it's pretty good. But basically that book is about a little witch whose job it is to find the undying fire. And in the end, the undying fire appears to be the spirit of an old witch who dies, and that old witch is supposed to be Anya. So the undying fire is supposed to represent the story that Anya leaves behind, hence why Durin has the title The Undying Fire. But it also makes me wonder a little bit more about Voyager, because Voyager was a bit of a scribe. They were supposed to go around the universe collecting all of these stories about all these different planets and civilizations. And I just wonder if, looking at Nibelung, they saw the undying fire. They saw a story that was more bright and beautiful than any other story they've ever seen before. And if so, that would connect Voyager to the Hexen Circle, which has implications I don't know if I really want to get into right now, and I'm really side-eyeing Octavia at this point. Also, if you didn't know, the lore of Durin's sword is actually the continuation of The Little Witch and the Undying Fire, and it seems to me at least to be referring to the story of Nibelung, allegorically. But I do like the idea of a story being like a little light that you carry within you forever. I think that's pretty cute. Now I gotta say, there's a lot of stuff that I had to cut from this video. Even though this video is super long, there is stuff that still didn't make the cut. For example, if time is a story within a book, then perhaps the Mare Javari, which is a place that Venti sort of blew off the timeline, is just a page that got ripped out of the book. And then Asmodee, as the Shade of Space, might actually have the ability to pass through the pages of the book. In fact, I do wonder if the fact that she, contains space within cubes is her way of, preserving different drafts of the world, different fragments of the story that got blown off or forgotten or discarded or whatever. And speaking of preserving time, I got to thinking about Vetterfilnir again, because when we meet him within Teyvat, he's, talking to us through that giant purple crystal thing, which still looks a lot like the crystal that Deshret turned into. I am not letting that theory die until I have to. And I might not have to, because Vetterfilnir says he'll be waiting for us at the end of time. But the end of time would either be the end of the storybook, or it could be that his location is actually within the Lunar Palace. And I'm still not over the fact that the portal of Rukkhadevata opened for Deshret looks an awful lot like a moon gate. Because if it is, that means Deshret may have ended up in the Lunar Palace as well. Not that I necessarily think he's alive or anything, but, he might show up as a purple gemstone souvenir, and maybe that's how Vetterfilnir is communicating, a la Heart's Desire, for those of you who've read that book. And actually, speaking of books, a lot of the books within the game get completely recontextualized when you start looking at it through this lens. Vera's Melancholy comes to mind, with Ike saying only the future can save the past kind of thing. I also think a lot about Time Tracker, which talks about closed causal loops. That story applies to the paradox of the key, but it's also interesting because that story looks at time as if it's been bounced between 2 different mirrors. So mirrors are basically reflecting time, and that makes me think of the moon's reflection, and then I just kind of go full circle being like, oh, he just kind of exited the timeline and then came back. Oh my god, I can't believe there are still notes on this notepad, all these things I didn't talk about yet. I think I'm just gonna let you guys do it in the comment section, because if I keep going anymore, my editor really will hunt me down. And I think that altercation will not end well. So let's wrap things up. I know I was a bit all over the place in this theory, but you know, I had a lot to say. And you know what? It's also totally okay if I failed to convince you that time travel isn't happening in Teyvat, because that really wasn't my goal here. I really just wanted to provide a counter argument to the time travel answer, partly because I think it keeps things more interesting, partly because I think that's probably not entirely what Hoyo's going for, because the book metaphor seems to be a little bit more in line with the repeating themes that we see throughout their games, and partly because I'm just a time travel hater and I'm gonna cope until I can't cope no mope. More, that one. But if you do like the time travel argument instead of what I presented, then I'd love to recommend this channel to you. This channel has gone above and beyond when it comes to trying to explain certain phenomenon in Teyvat using real math and real physics. So if you like time travel, you'll probably love that. I hate time travel, I still loved that. Okay, I'm actually going for real now, so thank you all my lovely channel members for all your direct support. You guys are amazing. And I will, of course, issue another thanks to you, dear viewer, for watching this incredibly long video. Make sure to grab a snack, drink some water, and take care of yourselves until I see you again in the next video and also in the new year. Because it's the end of 2025. We're going into 2026. Oh my God, time moves so fast. So this is me signing off. I'll see you next time.